So, I've been asked to give a talk to a group of women at the local Episcopal Church, and I'm going to have about 20 minutes or so to talk, maybe 25. It's in the context of a lunch meeting they're having. And of course, I can expect that these folks would probably not have had any previous exposure to Buddhism. The rector at the church, with whom I have a relationship, suggested to the leader of this group that they contact me. There aren't a lot of Buddhists in our area, and I give them great credit, really, for wanting to hear something about Buddhism. Now, I only just learned a day or two ago that the way they have framed this talk in terms of a title is the history of Buddhism. But I had come up with an outline myself in which I had thought that I would focus on a Buddhist tale of three stories and five lists as a way of, communicating something about Buddhism to this group that, again, knows nothing about it really, and who basically are coming from a Christian perspective. So what I thought I'd do in this video is to actually just sort of speak off the top of my head based on this outline that I created to sort of see how it times out as much as anything, and maybe to get feedback from a person or two here in my personal life as to whether or not this kind of content is what a group like this would want to hear. So you can construe this as sort of a dress rehearsal, if you will, or just a way of sort of practicing something that might be appropriate for this kind of group in this kind of setting. And again, I'll be timing it to see how long it takes me to get through whatever it is that comes off the top of my head. Again, these are not really highly prepared remarks. So I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to this group about Buddhism. I see where you've indicated that the title is The History of Buddhism, and I have to tell you that the whole range of scriptures in Buddhism consists of like 100 volumes of 1,000 pages each. So it may be a little bit difficult for me to give you the total picture in 20 minutes. But I thought that I would try to frame it in terms of three stories and five lists. Buddhists are famous for their lists, and maybe by giving you a few of these lists, it'll give you a sense of what some of the doctrine is. In terms of the stories, there again, we can hit some of the history, because the story I want to start with is the story of Sakyamuni Buddha. He was an actual historical figure who lived in 500 BC, and he lived, of course, in India and was a prince. He was born to wealth, to privilege, and the way the sort of mythology of his life evolved, it is said that when he was born, a wise man came to his father and said, "Your son, he's either going to be a great king or he's going to be a great holy man." And of course, the king was very much preferring that his son become a king, in other words, to follow in his own footsteps. So he protected Sakyamuni, whose name at that time was Siddhartha Gautama. He protected him and kept him from being able to see the outside world where there was, sickness, old age, and death. But the prince at some point took it upon himself to ask one of the servants to take him out, and he saw these things, these sources of suffering, and these inspired him to make a commitment in his own life to try to find a solution to the problem of suffering. So at about the age of 26, actually after he had married and had a son, he left the palace, he left his family, and he followed the life of a mendicant, which was not uncommon in that day and age. In other words, he went out and wandered around and practiced asceticism in order to sort of discover the truth and again, more fundamentally, to find an answer to the problem of suffering. Well, he did this for about 6 years. He followed various teachers, and none of them really were able to lead him to what he considered to be the ultimate truth, even though he did practice extreme forms of asceticism. But at one point, when he was virtually dying, he was so thin and emaciated, he ended up accepting some food from a person who offered it to him. And he then gained some strength and sat down below a tree It's called the Bodhi tree. And he said to himself, I am not going to leave this tree until I become enlightened, until I am able to find the solutions, find the answer to the questions that I've been asking. So he sat there and he sat there and he meditated and he meditated and experienced all kinds of phenomena, including various temptations of various sorts. But eventually he became enlightened. He became the Buddha, or the awakened one. And we know him as the Buddha of the Sakya clan, Sakyamuni Buddha. And again, he was a historical figure. He went on from that point and he preached for 45 years. His first step, frankly, was to go to visit again with the 5 seekers that he had been sort of hanging out with. And they at first didn't want to have anything to do with him because he sort of broke the pattern of asceticism. But what the Buddha found was that a better path really is the middle way between excessive asceticism and excessive indulgence. And this was in some ways his fundamental teaching. But in terms of content, to get one of our lists, the content of his teaching were the so-called Four Noble Truths that I think can be perhaps most easily explained within kind of a medical model. In other words, he determined that the diagnosis for human suffering was what he called dukkha. Dukkha is a word that means unsatisfactoriness or suffering, discontent or stress. So this is the diagnosis. And then in the context of a medical model, what comes next is the etiology or the cause. And what the Buddha found was that the cause of dukkha is craving or clinging. Next, of course, we have the prognosis. And the prognosis in this case is good in the sense that he discovered that dukkha ceases with the relinquishment of that craving. Okay, but how do you do that? Then comes the prescription. And the prescription, or the cure in this case, is the Eightfold Path. That is the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So here we have a second major list, the Eightfold Path. And I'm not going to dwell on all of these in great depth, but I've given you a handout that describes them that you can reflect on after the meeting. But they basically involve right understanding, which is the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, right intention and resolve, right speech, which is abstaining from lying, malicious or divisive speech, abusive or harsh speech, and idle chatter. This is actually a tough one. Fourth is right action, which is abstention from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And then 5, right livelihood. 6 is right effort. 7, right mindfulness, which includes basically the meditation kinds of approaches. And 8, right concentration, or the development of wisdom. So these practices, which again he preached throughout the land as he really formulated a monastic kind of community surrounding him as they traveled, these form the core, along with a few other teachings, of what we refer to now as the Theravada school of Buddhism, or the school of the elders. This is the early form of Buddhism that is basically based on what his followers recollected as his teaching at the time that this historical figure was alive. So there we have it, 500 BC, and then moving up to about 100 AD, we have a new development in Buddhism called the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle. And the idea here is that we have the figure of the Bodhisattva. In other words, the ideal is not to just listen to what the Buddha's words were or what his verbal teachings were, but to actually look what he did, which was the preaching and the trying to help people with their suffering. So the Bodhisattva is a person, a Buddha-to-be, if you will, who makes vows. And he vows essentially to save all beings. In other words, he vows to defer his or her own enlightenment until he can help all beings to sort of get across the sea of suffering to the other shore of enlightenment. So in that sense, he wants to create a great vehicle that will fit everybody rather than simply going across that sea of suffering in his own small boat. Now, this led to a proliferation of the belief in a variety of cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And one major cosmic bodhisattva was called Dharmakara. And the story of Dharmakara is that in the land that he resided in, and this was eons ago, and again, now we're in sort of a mythopoetic realm, he made vows. He made 48 vows in the presence of a Buddha called Lokesvara Raja. And his 18th vow is the one that is the core of what the belief system was that developed as the Pure Land school of Buddhism within Mahayana Buddhism. And this school I want you to be thinking about in terms of its parallels with Christian beliefs and Christian bases for faith. Because what this is that the 18th vow was that he said that I will not become a Buddha unless I can create a land, a pure land, a heaven, if you will, where any beings who entrust me, who have faith in me, who rely upon my power, the power of my vow, can be reborn there when they die. So I'm assuming that this probably sounds in some ways familiar with the Christian faith-based belief system. Now, the fact of the matter is, according to this story, is that he worked for eons of time. He worked and worked and worked to create all this merit that he could then transfer to us suffering beings, us beings who are filled with the poisons of greed and anger and ignorance. And so by doing so, again, by merely entrusting in him, by relying on the power of his vow, we can be reborn in his pure land of bliss. So there were these scriptures that were established on the basis of this story of Dharmakara, who then became this Amida Buddha. And so I just want to make a point here of indicating another of the lists, which is basically a list of the practices of the Bodhisattva. And a Bodhisattva conducts himself in terms of 6 practices or perfections, which are ways of getting to the other shore. Number 1 is generosity or giving. Number 2 is morality, discipline, or ethical conduct. Number 3, patience, endurance, or forbearance. Number 4 is diligence, effort, and vigor. Number 5 is meditative concentration or contemplation, which again comes back to meditation. And then 6 is wisdom or insight, which is referred to as prajnaparamita. And I mentioned the vows. Well, the 4 great bodhisattva vows are, beings are numberless. I vow to help them all cross over the sea of suffering. Afflictions such as aversion, greed, and confusion are inexhaustible. I vow to penetrate and cut through them all. Dharma gates are boundless, and Dharma means the Buddha's teachings. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter and cultivate them all. And finally, the Buddha's path is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. So anyway, here we are at about 100 AD with these scriptures regarding the Pure Land. But the Pure Land approach evolved over time, and so we jump forward to 13th century Japan, when a fellow named Shinran Shonin refined this Pure Land teaching to its ultimate form of a method of pure grace, that no longer were any kind of works necessary in order to be saved. No longer would there need to be any recitation of any mantras, such as I take refuge in Amida Buddha, which some people had argued should be repeated over and over again, which in the Japanese is Namo Amida Butsu. These things were no longer necessary. All that was needed was entrustment. And as far as that goes, just a single thought moment of entrustment in Amida and the power of his vow. And then we were saved in the sense that then we were embraced, never to be abandoned by Amida, and could have confidence that when we die, we will be born in his pure land. So again, think about the parallels here. So now as far as my own story of grace, entrustment, and gratitude, I was about 30 years old, maybe 31, and I was in a novel situation, a new situation for me that was kind of anxiety-provoking. And I didn't have any special religious practices at that time. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, actually, where I was baptized and confirmed. I was in the Episcopal Church because my grandparents, who came over from another country, the Episcopal Church in Detroit, where they moved to, sort of took them under their wing and helped them acclimate to English and to America. So again, as an adolescent and young adult, I did attend the Episcopal Church and sang in the choir. But when I got to college and beyond, I really didn't have that as an important part of my life. But in this circumstance of confusion and anxiety, I kind of, frankly, got down on my knees, said to the stars, to the sky, "Help! I needed some help." And I wasn't necessarily expecting any help, but there it was. The help came in the form of an experience of complete freedom from anxiety, totally. And it wasn't just a momentary experience. It lasted for days and weeks and months and years, frankly. But for the next few months, I sort of explored different things, Christian mystics, different kinds of religious approaches. I would recommend to any of you Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. That was an important text for me to kind of see that various religions had folks who had perhaps similar kinds of mystical or experiences of, some kind of spiritual awakening. But anyway, what I did was I ended up veering toward Buddhism, and particularly this Mahayana, or Great Vehicle approach. I was bold enough to put out a little thing in the newspaper saying I was willing to teach people about Buddhism, and there were three people who came, and one of them, it turns out, was an elderly woman who, she and I ended up getting very deep into the study of a scripture called the Lotus Sutra. And it was through her, through Lucille, that I came to appreciate more and more the Pure Land approach to Buddhism. And so that's the lineage, really, that I have come to follow. And for all Buddhists, I'll leave you with the last list, which is basically the three refuges, or three treasures, that form the core of our way of expressing our faith, if you will, when we say, "I take refuge in the Buddha." And the Buddha, of course, this means the historical Buddha, can also mean Amida Buddha, or one's own potential for awakening, because each of us has the Buddha nature within us, according to Buddhism. And I take refuge, secondly, in the Dharma, or again, as I said, the Buddha's teaching, the various scriptures, the various commentaries and treatises. And this refuge in the Dharma implies refuge in the Buddha's teaching of liberation and the ultimate truth toward which it points. And then finally, refuge in the Sangha, or the monastic community, or those who have achieved at least some degree of awakening, or more broadly, the community of followers of the Buddhist path. Now, I'm obviously not ordained. I'm not a scholar. I'm an upasaka, or a lay Buddhist. A layman. But in that context, I've had the impulse to try to share Buddhism with others. And again, I'm happy for this opportunity to share with you all. And frankly, here at the church, I was given the opportunity after my retirement to start with some friends of mine, a Buddhist group that ran for 6 years. And I very much am grateful to the church for giving me that opportunity to use this space as a place where we could meet. In addition, we had at one time a meditation group, and I want to mention in particular that we also had a group which was ongoing much prior to my involvement, in fact, many years prior, and you had this group here at the church called Going Deeper. And this was a group where there were some folks who really wanted to experience what I refer to as kind of this non-dual consciousness, this sense of what is the nature of ultimate reality. And part of how that can be sort of glimpsed, if you will, within Buddhism, we have meditational kinds of approaches, and you'll notice on the back of the one handout I gave you with the lists, there's some instruction for meditation. But the other handout I gave you is regarding the practice of centering prayer, or contemplative prayer. And this is a form of prayer that evolved from the so-called desert fathers and mothers way back in the day in Egypt, but that has been revitalized in recent decades by people like Thomas Keaton and Cynthia Bourgeois and Richard Rohr and others. Now, this is a type of approach that's very Christian-oriented, and, again, I've given you a description of it so that if you want to sort of explore that for your own life, that's available to you. But in the meantime, once more, I'd like to thank you, and with that said, I'll open it up for any questions anybody has regarding Buddhism. Thank you.